Hello everyone, this is Jackie Williams, and in this video I want to share with you some ideas for using your Whisper White craft ink pad. You may have purchased it or you may have seen it in the catalog and wondered what it was for. And in this video I want to show you 5 ways you can use it, but there are certainly other ways you can use it as well. And for all of my examples, I will be using the Calming Camellia stamp set. So let's go to my work desk. So before we get started, let's just take a quick look at the products we'll be using. This is the Whisper White ink pad and the refill, and I'm showing you both because when you order the Whisper White ink pad, it comes uninked, but it also comes with the bottle of ink. So you will need to initially put ink into your ink pad and then just top it up as needed. I actually prefer this because some of the techniques you might want your ink pad to be that little bit more dry, and this way you can control pretty easily how wet and dry your ink pad is. And then the Calming Camellia stamp set. This is available during Celebration 2022, and I have absolutely loved playing with this one. It is just gorgeous. And you'll see that it's got this incredible detail as well as some lovely words with beautiful font. And my personal favorite is just this simple little flourish that you can add alongside your flowers. And I can see that this one you could use with some of your other stamp sets as well. So let's start stamping. The first way you can use your Whisper White ink is by coloring with it. So I'm going to stamp the large Camellia, and you can see that when you look at the actual rubber, there isn't a lot of detail by all appearances, but when it stamps absolutely beautifully. So I've got some old olive cardstock here, and I'm going to stamp my Camellia with Mossy Meadow. I'm just going to stamp that here in the corner. And look at that incredible detail. Then next, I'm going to use the Flourish stamp with Pear Pizzazz, so a slightly lighter green, and just add a few flourishes in through here. Maybe through there, and maybe another one there. Beautiful. Now, another technique that's kind of unrelated to the Whisper White, but it's just a fun technique, is you can take some of your other stamps. Well, basically you can take any stamp and ink it up in your ink and just start on a scrap paper and just drag it along. And that will give you kind of like this smear of ink along the side, which is just a different look than using your sponge daubers or your blending brushes. It gives possibly more of an antique look, but just wanted to show you that technique. Now for our coloring in, we will want to use a blender pen, which is different than the Stampin' Blends, and some white ink, which I've just put into a little dish, and I've just used the refill bottle for that. Now the reason why I'm using a blender pen instead of a water painter is because we have stamped this with a water-based ink, which means that if I put a water painter over top with water in it, obviously, then this ink would most likely bleed. So we want to use the blender pen so that our base ink doesn't bleed. Now I found when I was experimenting with this that it's best to do one petal at a time. So I've just picked up a little bit of that white ink, and I'm just going to do this first petal. And then I'll do the second petal up here. But what I don't want to do is color over that delineation between the petals, because we still want to be able to see that they are individual petals. And then as your pen runs out of ink, you'll just pick up a little bit more. Now you'll notice that this white ink actually lightens as it dries. I like that look because then you can still see the lines and the details underneath that white ink. However, if you want much more of an actual white effect, then you would just pick up more ink than I'm picking up and apply that. So here's the finished one, and this one, instead of using Old Olive, I have used Mary Merlot, one of my favorite burgundy colors, and then just stamped the words directly onto the card base for just a simple card. And here is a stepped up version, and you can see I've still colored the flowers in with the white ink, but with this one I added a few gold splatters and a second layer underneath here, as well as added more ribbon and the gold twine. And then I stepped it up even one more time, and this one is my favorite, all still using only Mary Merlot paper. So this time I've used the Mary Merlot for my flowers, but then used Blackberry Bliss, so an even darker ink for the little swirls and the words. And this time added a layer of embossing and also another layer of Mary Merlot cardstock, which I inked, so it's a little bit darker, and then did some tearing and added the ribbon. So I hope you like those. Now, the second idea for using your Whisper White ink pad is to actually use it on your embossed papers or cardstock. So you can use a sponge dauber or a blending brush or a sponge to apply. However, your Whisper White ink pad has a sponge base already, so you don't have to use something else. You can just use the ink pad directly and just apply that to your embossed papers. So this is the Hive folder. Now this is one of those techniques where you actually don't want your ink pad to be really wet. Otherwise you're going to get a lot of ink and maybe it would get down into the recesses, where just that little bit more dry is easier to get the effect that you want. A third way that you can use your white ink pad is actually inking edges of your cardstock. Now, if you've inked edges before, you've probably often used a brown or a gray or even the same color. But did you know you can also use white for a finished edge look, but something that's not too dark? Now, you can just use your ink pad directly like we did before, or you could use a sponge dauber or a sponge like this and just apply it. You have a little bit more control if you do it with something separate. I don't know that I would recommend using a blending brush. You certainly can, but that blending brush would probably need to be only for white from then on, because this is a different kind of ink than your water-based ink. This is what is called a pigment ink, which means it sits on top of the paper more like a paint. It doesn't sink into the paper as much as a water-based ink would. And the ink pads actually aren't pink. Mine just has turned pink from some other project I was doing. Now let me show you the finished sample using those items that I showed you. So this is the embossing folder, and you can see that the raised parts of the embossing folder are lighter than the recessed part, so it really just brings out that texture. And then I have inked around the edges of this evening evergreen on the background of the paper. Now I should say that this sample and some of the other samples I'm using today are inspired by the catalog samples, the ones right in the Celebration catalog. I thought that they had fantastic examples in the book for this one. And here are just another couple of examples of using the white ink over your embossing folder. It's actually this flower. These are from the Magnolia embossing folder, and I did scissor cut them out. But it is just an embossing folder, which I then brushed white ink over to bring out the details that little bit more. Now let's move on to our fourth way of using the Whisper White ink, and that is to use it just for stamping. So let's start with our large Camellia. I have soft suede cardstock here and early espresso ink, so I'm just going to ink up my flower and stamp that here in the corner. And then I'm going to take the leaf image from this set and just stamp a few of those up the side. Now, then I'm going to stamp our flourish stamp in the Whisper White. Now, this is where you probably want your ink pad to be that little bit more inked than when you are using it on, for example, an embossing folder. Now, it does look very rich and white right now, but it does dry a little bit lighter than it initially stamps. But it is quite beautiful and gives you that nice contrast against the dark paper and the dark ink. So here is the finished sample with the soft suede, and you can see how the white has lightened up quite a bit, and now it just kind of tones in and looks beautiful. And I've kept this one quite simple and just stamped my words directly on. But this one, I actually took the stamping over onto the back. This is an idea that I saw on Pinterest that I thought was really quite fun, to just carry on your stamping, and then inside did the same and just carried on the stamping outside of my little panel here too. So I hope you like that one. And here is another sample made by one of my team members, Helen Wiggum. So this one is what's called shadow stamping, but it is just stamping with your white ink. So she stamped with probably Coastal Cabana ink and then moved her stamp just very slightly to one side and then stamped the same image again in the Whisper White. So you get that beautiful shadow effect that you can only get by using the white ink. Now, the fifth way that we can use our white ink is actually to create splatters. If you do splattering, we often do splattering in colors and neutrals and black, but you know, you can also create white splatters. And this can even take the place of using pearls or other embellishments. Just by adding that little bit of white can sometimes really lift an image. So there's several ways you can do this, but probably the easiest way that I found is to just drop some of the white ink into a little dish and add a bit of water to it, and then use a water painter and make sure that the water is flowing through so it's fairly wet. And then don't squeeze it anymore, but use your finger and just tap. And then you'll just get some beautiful splatters like this. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the white ink does take a while to dry. Therefore, you need to either just let it sit and do its thing for a while, or take it over to your heat tool and heat it on the low setting just to dry that. But make sure you don't touch it until it's completely dry. And here is my finished sample with the white splattering. And again, this is inspired by the samples right out of the catalog. And I just love that addition of that little bit of white just to lift the gray so that it's not too dark of a card. Now, I did actually use some pearls, but the white splatters also add to that effect. And then I carried the image in through the inside too and lined it with smoky slate, which isn't usual. We usually use white or vanilla inside. Now this one also has some of the other techniques. I did paint that with the white as well as the splatters, but I also then picked up some color and added a bit of color into the white ink so that I've got that little bit of Blackberry Bliss in through the flowers too. So there we have it. Thanks so much for joining me, and I hope you learned a few more ways you can use your Whisper White ink pad, as well as got some ideas and inspiration for using the Calming Camellia stamp set. Please subscribe while you're here, and if you enjoyed this video, leave me a comment. I always love to hear from you. If you have any questions, ask them below. And thanks so much for joining me. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.